Welcome back to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. We are super thrilled to have a new guest joining us on the show, the great Stuart Vanderkooi. Hi, Stuart.
Hi, John. Good to see you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. For those of you not familiar with Stuart, he's an instructor at West Point, and we're going to be talking about an interesting guy in Admiral Fletcher. Before we get into that, I do have to read a disclaimer real quick. The opinions expressed herein are those of the individual and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. Army, the U.S. Military Academy, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Okay. Who is this Fletcher guy? Why are we talking about him?
So Frank Jack Fletcher becomes an admiral in the Second World War. He's promoted to vice admiral shortly before. He's a key figure in the early part of the Pacific War, and he's involved in some of the major battles that it's turned things around after Pearl Harbor, you might say, like Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal. So he's a key figure, but not a self-promoter. And I've noticed that when I first started reading about World War II in the Pacific, you hear a lot about Spruance and Fletcher, and you have to go back and look at like the task organization to figure out who exactly is in charge of what. So
yeah, we were talking beforehand. He kind of gets white noise by Halsey and Nimitz and Patton and Yamamoto and some of the other big names out there. Is it just he was kind of a quiet, humble guy, or he didn't like to tout his accomplishments as much as others?
Yeah, I think it's both of those things. He's humble. He's not a self-promoter. His historical reputation after the war suffers for it because people like Samuel Eliot Morison, who write the official Navy history, don't have a very good opinion of him and will write him into the history as being at fault for various things like refueling and overly cautious. But more recently, there's been a lot of historical work done to reanalyze Morison's claims and some of the other admirals who didn't like Fletcher and work to undermine his reputation after the war.
Yeah, and we'll come to that on our last question with his legacy. But yeah, let's kind of dive into his background. He was born April 1885 in Marshalltown, Iowa. And from there, he actually goes to the Naval Academy, graduates 1906. How do you think his early naval education and training prepared him to command during World War II?
Well, when I look at his time at the Naval Academy, it's what stands out to me is some of the big names that he was classmates with and relationships that he was building. And I'm a graduate of the Military Academy, and I'm here teaching right now. And that's one of the best parts of being a part of this organization is just the lasting friendships you may make, and you run into your classmates and people you went through basic training with out in the Army. And I can imagine it was similar for Fletcher. And especially important, because he went into 2 world wars with his classmates. So fellow members of his class were Robert Gormley, John S. McCain, Senator McCain's grandfather, and Halsey. Halsey wasn't his classmate, but Halsey, Kimmel, Nimitz, Spruance all would have been at the academy while Fletcher was there.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the 1915 class at West Point where the stars fell upon.
Right. Yep, yeah, exactly.
Well, let's talk about his early career in Mexican intervention of 1914-15. He earned the U.S. Medal of Honor for Distinguished Service during the U.S. occupation of Veracruz, Mexico. First of all, what happened at Veracruz, and how did they foreshadow his leadership style?
This was an intervention by the U.S. Navy. Woodrow Wilson decided to occupy Veracruz or send a naval detachment there that was actually commanded by Fletcher's uncle, Frank Friday Fletcher. And it wasn't too out of the ordinary to bring Jack Fletcher along with. Jack ends up, he's in charge of a ship that's evacuating refugees, and he gets 350 of them on board under fire, according to his Medal of Honor citation. But he also has to get refugees out of Mexico via train and work with the Mexican soldiers and, some of the guerrillas and people that are there and threatening these refugees. And he wins the Medal of Honor for courage under fire and safely evacuating all these people.
It's a pretty good start to your career.
Absolutely. But again, in for Fletcher, he wasn't a self-promoter. You could see the award on his chest. You've got the blue with the stars, and he had the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he would tell you about it if you asked him. But he wasn't touting that award or being very forward about it.
Right. Well, he also serves in World War I aboard destroyers in the Atlantic, escorting convoys against German U-boats. What lessons in World War I naval warfare might have influenced Fletcher's tactics later on?
I think the most important thing that he learned or displayed and then continued to develop was seamanship. He had a reputation as an excellent seaman. And so he started off in command of a yacht. This was an old beat up yacht that was part of the so-called suicide fleet. And they called it that because these were all older ships that they pressed into commission for convoy duty in the North Atlantic. And, the joke was crossing the Atlantic and would be suicide in these vessels, but
Right.
He's able to do that in the yacht. And then he takes command of the destroyer USS Benham at the end of the war. And again, destroyers nowadays they're much larger, but back then a destroyer in the rough North Atlantic seas, just, trying to maintain station on your convoy could be very difficult, but he did very well.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. It's not like destroyers we think of now that have a good complement of men and hundreds of weapons on it. It like you said, it was a repurposed yacht that they just pressed into service.
Right.
Let's talk about his in-war commands in between World War I and World War II. And looks like he held staff positions, got some broad operational experience. What do you think his interwar service, how did it shape kind of his understanding of naval aviation and the importance of it?
Yeah, so he's actually able to see some early aviation in the Veracruz occupation, right? And from what I understand, that kind of piqued his interest in this as a new weapon of war. He tries to take flight lessons, and he was, a lot of the senior naval officers interested in aviation, they were called Johnny come lately by some of the flight guys, but he was one of them. He tried to take flying lessons, but he didn't have the eyesight to complete the training. He certainly must have developed an appreciation for naval aviation as a weapon of the future and respect for the aviators who were able to do that, which you see later on when he's very good about consulting senior flyers for their advice, realizing he's not actually, a brown shoe. He's a black shoe, which means he's a surface warfare guy.
Right. And I think it's critical that he kind of saw the future. Like, we can't just, cruise around on boats anymore. Like, aircraft are coming. We have to understand them and know how to fight them effectively.
Yes. And World War II illuminates very quickly for people the vulnerability of battleships. You have the sinking of the Prince of Wales and the repulse off of Malaya early in the war, then Pearl Harbor, and then you get to Coral Sea and Midway, and it's very quickly understood that carriers are the new decisive weapon.
Yeah, and I appreciate your segue into my next question. Pearl Harbor occurs December 1941. After the attack, Fletcher is one of the few available carrier task force commanders. What challenges did he face commanding carriers in the chaotic early months after Pearl Harbor?
Yeah, and so I'll just say, while Pearl Harbor happened December 7, 1941, Fletcher was out at sea because he was in command of a heavy cruiser force, a scouting force, USS Astoria, Minneapolis, New Orleans, and San Francisco. So he's out at sea when it happens, and then he returns to Pearl Harbor a couple days later. He survives, the personnel shakeup that happens after Pearl Harbor, where husband E. Kimmel is eventually fired. So is General Short, and they're replaced by MacArthur and Nimitz, I believe, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. But it's a very tense time. You You can see this in the relief of Wake Island. The Navy wants to do something, but they're just getting the intelligence against the Japanese started, and carriers initially are in very short supply. And that's always going to be a concern early in this war, before the new Essex class carriers come around, 1943. The U.S. Navy in the Pacific only has 2, 3, 4 at most available at one time. So it's creates a lot of tension and risk when you decide to use your aircraft carriers.
Yeah, and I think the confidence was obviously shaken. You mentioned they fired Kimmel. They just lost 2,000 men in Pearl Harbor. So I think for anyone coming in that situation, whether it's Fletcher or Nimitz, it's probably hard to restore the confidence. But I mean, that's probably job number one.
Yes.
Well, you kind of mentioned it, the Battle of Wake Island, which I don't know what happened here. He's tasked with relieving Wake Island, but is ordered to withdraw before reaching it. I mean, he's following orders, but is his withdrawal from Wake justified or overly cautious? Like, do you think he would have lost once he got there? What's your feeling on this?
Well, so I'll just give a little background on Wake. So there's a U.S. garrison there, Marines, and there's aircraft, and the U.S. Navy knows that this is a vulnerability or that the garrison on Wake Island is vulnerable, because it's way out there in the Pacific, and they decide to try and send a relief force or a force that can beef up the defense on Wake Island, because they think this is going to be a place where Japan is going to attack, and it absolutely is. So Fletcher is in charge of Task Force 15. He's got the carrier Saratoga, and there's going to be another carrier force that goes south and is supposed to conduct a sort of diversionary attack to pull the Japanese eyes away from Wake, because the Japanese are always looking to sink the U.S. carriers because they didn't get them at Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
So they're looking to draw the U.S. carriers out so that they can sink them with their Kido Butai, which is their big 6-carrier strike force. And if they can neutralize the U.S. carriers, they know that this thing is not going to go well for the U.S. So anyway, Fletcher heads to Wake with the relief force, and they have some trouble along the way. I think there's some delays getting the Saratoga out of Pearl Harbor. That delays the operation for a day. And it just so happens that the Japanese attack the island a day before Fletcher is going to land. He receives, this is, I think, where the fueling criticism of Fletcher starts. And that's, Morrison writes that, well, Fletcher, he was too busy fueling when he should have charged ahead to Wake Island and relieve the garrison. But there's a great book on Fletcher, and this is by John B. Lundstrom. It's called Black Shoe Carrier Admiral, and he's done a ton of research trying to rehabilitate maybe the reputation of redeem. Thank you. The Fletcher's reputation. And he says, look, when all of these previous calculations on refueling were made under ideal conditions. And what the critics don't account for is that these, your destroyers are the ones that got to refuel the most often because they're light, they're fast. But there's a perceived Japanese submarine threat out in the Pacific, which is, I think, a realistic assumption. And your destroyers, when they're running around the task force or the convoy, they'll go off and chase a potential contact, and then they've got to come all the way back, charge back, get back on station, and they're burning a ton of fuel to go to flank speed. So you've got to take that into account, and just the heavy seas into refueling. So Fletcher decides to refuel, and by the time he's in position to relieve Wake, the Japanese have already landed, and the garrison sends a message to Pearl Harbor to Admiral Pai, who's in command of the overall operation, and says, we've been overrun. It doesn't look good. That's when Pai decides to pull the plug on the operation and orders Fletcher to pull his Task Force 14 and head back to Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the way you described it, there's good reasoning. Like if you look at the macro situation, Wake Island's in the middle of nowhere, like you said, it's very far off. So would have Fletcher's force made a difference? Maybe it was too late. They already landed. Or, like you said, if he hadn't refueled and just gone straight through, maybe he would have got there in time. But that doesn't mean he would have won. He still might have lost. So maybe the decision that was made was the right decision. Let's save this force for our next battle. It's unfortunately it's too late for the Wake Island Marines, but on the macro, maybe it's better that we save this force for later operations.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely correct. And you just don't know what would have happened. Had the Saratoga gotten out of Pearl Harbor early enough, they also had the slowest oiler in the fleet. And through studying Fletcher, I really have gained an appreciation for just, at underway refueling, as it's called, which is a skill that the U.S. Navy has to learn and develop, and they get really good at it by the end of the war. But fuel is always foremost on their minds, maybe after the threat from the enemy. But it's just something you don't always think about, but you have to consider. And I appreciate it especially because I'm a tank officer.
Oh.
And we've got big 70-ton Abrams tanks, and these things have a turbine engine in them. It's not a diesel,
right,
like most tanks, but your fuel consumption is huge. And if fuel is available, you get it. And I know that's not a perfect analogy to the Navy, but I certainly appreciate somebody who's fuel minded, just with my background.
Sure. And it's the old saying, amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics. Like, he was looking after his logistics. So I think I'm on board so far with Fletcher. I think he's doing the right thing.
Right. A few more aircraft at Wake, maybe that would have helped. But the Japanese send a pretty powerful force up there. And it's hard to know if that would have turned out any differently. But the Marines fight an absolutely heroic resistance on the island, but they eventually have to surrender to the Japanese and spend a lot of time in captivity.
Correct. Yeah. But Fletcher bounces back pretty quick. At the Battle of Coral Sea, May 1942, he's commanding U.S. forces in the first carrier versus carrier battle in history, halting Japan's advance towards Port Moresby. How significant is Fletcher's decision-making here in achieving a strategic victory despite heavy losses?
That's a good question. One of the first decisions he makes is to detach his cruiser force, a force of heavy cruisers who are under the command of Vice Admiral Crace, who's an Australian, but he's in the Royal Navy. And we're down in the Coral Sea now, and then there's an archipelago by Port Moresby called the Louisades, and he sends his cruisers out to the west to be prepared to attack a Japanese transport fleet in case they come through that archipelago on their way to Port Moresby. And then they've got a bunch of heavy cruisers there ready to take out these transports. But the risk is, if you detach your heavy cruisers, these cruisers carry a lot of anti-aircraft fire capability and can help protect the aircraft carrier. And if your cruisers go over, they're away from the carrier and they're outside the envelope of the combat air patrol, the fighter aircraft. So it's a risk, but Fletcher's a cruiser guy. Vice Admiral Crace is looking to get into some action, so he decides to do that, and it ends up working out well. It ends up working out in the sense that the Japanese don't destroy that cruiser force. The Port Moresby invasion force turns around before Crace is able to attack them. So that would be decision number one. The second, really set of decisions, just has to do with the challenges of carrier warfare, which is part of what makes this so interesting to me, is just the tension in the decision making and the risk involved. In Fletcher's, U.S. Navy decoding is able to read some Japanese transmissions, but a lot of the intelligence Fletcher is getting is partially decoded Japanese transmissions.
Yeah.
And almost ends in disaster when on 6 May, the day before the actual Battle of Coral Sea on 7 May, the Japanese carrier force and Fletcher's task force get within 70 miles of each other, but they don't know that they're there, due to weather and some scouting mistakes. But that could have ended very differently. He's got all sorts of decisions, like what's the bomb load, What is our combat air, 1,000-pound versus 500-pound bombs,
Right.
combat air patrol? How many planes do we put on torpedo plane patrol? When do we act on intel? And it's just, you're taking a risk when you decide, hey, we're going to strike, we're going to launch, because when you launch, you got to go, right? You got to kill the enemy carrier before he can get to you.
Well, and I think what's different with World War II, this isn't like World War One or even the Napoleonic Wars where the fleets just line up next to each other and broadside and shoot each other. These are carrier operations, so a lot of times they don't even see each other. It's just waves of
Yep.
planes going back and forth. So that's kind of unique to World War II.
Yes. And luckily, he makes enough of the right decisions. And the other thing is he trusts his subordinate commanders as well, and that's his command style. And we can address that a little more in Midway, because I think, giving control to Spruance is a great example of that as well. But, but even as soon as he takes over, he's a cruiser guy, he's a black shoe admiral, but he's willing to consult and take the advice of his senior aviation guys. And he would even bring some of the junior pilots up to the flag bridge and talk to, hey, what are you seeing? What do you recommend? What kind of intel do we have? And he's able to take all of that advice and make the right decision when it matters.
Yeah, and I think that's the sign of a good commander is knowing when and how to delegate. Like even Napoleon, he had his marshals. The Duke of Wellington had his generals that he would delegate things to. Now they're both micromanagers, but there's a point where you just have to trust your staff and be like, I need you to do this for me.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And especially with the limitations in communications technology. And oftentimes you have to give what we call our mission orders, which is here's the task and here's the intent. And you act based on the commander's intent.
Yeah.
But based whatever you're seeing, your best judgment, because it takes too long to send decisions up the chain of command, and then
Correct.
you're frozen, especially, and it doesn't even need to be said with carrier warfare. That's just not going to work because fortunes change in 15 minutes.
Speaking of, and you touched on earlier, the Battle of Midway, he serves as overall tactical commander of the U.S. carrier forces. And this battle is pretty much considered to be the turning point of the Pacific War. How did Fletcher's coordination with Admirals Spruance and Nimitz influence the outcome here?
Nimitz, he tags Fletcher to take over for Halsey, because Halsey has, I think it's a skin rash or something that's really debilitating, and he's not able to command the carrier forces at Midway. And then, they're through a repair effort, they're able to get the Yorktown out of Pearl Harbor with some emergency repairs and get 3 carriers up there. So Nimitz puts Fletcher in charge. He's the senior guy, but he's working very closely with Raymond Spruance. And Spruance later in the battle, and he gets most of the credit for Midway, but Fletcher is the overall commander and places a lot of trust in Spruance. And Spruance has 2 carriers, Fletcher has 1, and he lets Spruance operate independently also because they don't want to have all 3 aircraft carriers right next to one another. In the event one is found, you want to retain some kind of striking power and not lose all your carriers in one go, which is what happens to the Japanese.
Correct.
At least they lose 3, but there's one that survives a little bit longer and is eventually sunk.
Yeah. Well, there's something strange that happens in Midway. There's the Yorktown carrier is damaged, and Fletcher transferred command to Spruance. Do we know what happened here?
Yes, so the Yorktown is damaged, and Fletcher has to transfer his flag to the USS Astoria, which is a heavy cruiser. And once I'm not sure if it was before, I think it's once he's on the USS Astoria, he realizes, hey, Spruance is in a better position to control this thing. Mm-hmm. So he sends Spruance a message and says, I'll conform my task force to your movements. You're in charge. And Spruance is able to take that and launch his remaining attacks on the Japanese carriers and come out with this very decisive, important victory at Midway. You know, I think it's a significant thing for an admiral to do is hand off that control and trust Spruance that he's gonna make the right decisions, which he absolutely did.
I was trying to think of the right word for it. Was it humility, or was it just tactical trust that Spruance to make the right decision? Because I mean, it's not easy to, even if you're on another ship, to give up command and say, "Oh well, he's in a better spot to run it from here on out."
Yeah, I think it's a good assessment of the situation in realizing that Spruance is in the better position to run this battle from that point. And the Yorktown makes it out of the battle, but is sunk while it's on its way back to Pearl Harbor by a Japanese submarine.
Right. Let's talk about the Guadalcanal Campaign. That's August 1942. Fletcher commanded carriers covering the landings, but withdrew support after 2 days. Did Fletcher's withdrawal from Guadalcanal contribute to the early supply crisis faced by the Marines ashore?
Well, yeah, I think you could say that. The thing that makes fleet withdraw is the Battle of Savo Island in, I think it's 7 August 1942, but it's early on, and there's a screening force of cruisers in just north of Guadalcanal to protect the transport force. The Japanese send a night attack of heavy cruisers and a few destroyers down the slot into the Savo Island, Iron Bottom Sound north of Guadalcanal, and deal one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history to this cruiser force. So several U.S. and Australian cruisers are sunk and another heavily damaged, and this force has to withdraw. But the Japanese don't press their advantage and sink the vulnerable transport fleet. They decide to turn around and go back up the slot, mostly because they're also worried about air attack. They know once it's daytime, then they might be caught out in the open without air cover or sufficient air cover. So they turn around, and fortunately, the transport force isn't sunk off of Guadalcanal, but there are now the Marines have to fight for several weeks without naval coverage. You know, Fletcher's decision to withdraw, there's some confusion in the initial plan with Robert Gormley, who's eventually relieved by Halsey. Fletcher thinks he's got the leeway to make this decision and pull his carriers out, and because the Japanese are also there looking for the U.S. carriers. Like there's only a couple in the Pacific available right now. And Fletcher's eventually right, because he's going to fight the Battle of the Eastern Solomons against a Japanese. It's the third carrier-on-carrier battle in the Pacific War with good outcome for the United States. They sink a Japanese light carrier, but the Enterprise this time is damaged and has to go for extensive repairs back at Pearl Harbor. I think, just from what I understand, it was the right decision to not risk. Again, the carriers at this point are a strategic asset, to risk them close into Guadalcanal. But the trade-off is the Marines have to fight a very tenuous battle for many weeks on Guadalcanal. But eventually Halsey takes over, and we win a couple more naval battles off of Guadalcanal, Cape Esperance, and a nighttime action between battleships, naval battle of Guadalcanal, and the Marines are able to take Henderson Field and hold it.
Right. There's something, though, because of this, that starts to affect Fletcher's career. And he's criticized by some historians and officers, including Halsey, for being overly cautious. My question to you is, was he unfairly maligned compared to aggressive commanders like Halsey? But in my head, there were commanders who were not cautious at all, like Kimmel and Pearl Harbor, or Midway on the Indianapolis, and they paid the price for it. So it's like, well, do you want me to be cautious, or do you want me to be super aggressive? It seems like it's unfair criticism.
Right. And it's, caution, that term I think is unfairly applied at times. And it's one of those things where if you take a huge risk and you're successful, then, you're the hero of the battle, like the, military genius. And if you take a big risk and you're utterly defeated, then your reputation is, this guy made a huge mistake. What was he thinking? So it's a really tricky line to walk. And again, with carrier warfare, fortunes can change in a matter of minutes. And it's all about acting at the right time, sending your strike force, destroying the enemy carrier before he can find you. I don't know. I think Fletcher's record at, he's the guy at these major early U.S. victories. He's in charge, and we have to give credit absolutely to the guys and the machines that are flying and attacking the Japanese carriers, and all his subordinate commanders. Like, everybody's got a part to play. But Fletcher's in overall command at many of these key battles, and I think them being all important strategic victories, his record speaks for him itself. Overly cautious, I don't think that is the right way to paint him.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, going back to my Generals of Napoleon pod, if during the French Revolution, if the generals didn't have enough zeal and they were overly cautious, they could be guillotined. But if they fought a battle and lost for being aggressive, they could also be guillotined. So it was really hard to find that middle road there.
Right. And I think Fletcher understands the strategic importance of the carriers in the early part of the war. And again, there's at any time, sometimes there's two, sometimes there's three. It's 1942 to 1943. Carriers, that's all that the U.S. has, right? And they're outnumbered by the Japanese carrier force in many of these operational theaters. And Fletcher knows he's got to be careful. And he loses. The Lexington is sunk at Coral Sea. The Yorktown is sunk after Midway by a submarine, and the Enterprise is heavily damaged in the Eastern Solomons. And those are all things that he absolutely aware of in shaping his risk assessment when he decides, how far am I going to push the advantage before I'm at the end of my operational reach, or before I'm overextended.
It's kind of a double-edged sword. Like, go win us battles, but don't lose our aircraft carriers.
Right. He's not fired after any of these operations, despite the losses, but he's delivering very important early victories to the U.S. Navy.
Yeah, but later, his specific assignments after 1942 are sideshows. He goes to the Aleutians and the North Pacific. Was he sidelined due to politics or legitimate concerns about his command style?
Well, the way that I've read it is he's taken out of that command after the Eastern Solomons just to give him a break. I mean, you got to think of what he's been through and just the absolute mental stress of going through these very tense decision-making battles where he's deciding the fate of he could be sending, entire air forces to their death. He could lose another carrier. These are very difficult decisions to make, and not saying that he necessarily was suffering from any kind of combat fatigue, but that's what his bosses decided was, hey, we're going to just give you some rest, and Halsey's going to get in here, and Halsey does very well through 1943, 1944, and they rotate Fletcher out, and he's becomes in command of the Northern Pacific Theater, so the Aleutians, everything up north of where the central thrust will be. Oh, and so one piece on the politics that I can mention, from because that is also part of it, and there's many factors at play, but he does 2 tours in Washington in the interwar period, and Admiral King, who's overall in charge of the Navy, he's kind of on the lookout for what he calls Washington repeaters. And these are guys that come back to Washington multiple times. Fletcher does 2 tours there. So King kind of tags him early on as a Washington repeater, somebody who's, too close to the flagpole and, maybe working the politics in Washington. So he gets that reputation. I don't think Admiral King ever really likes Fletcher, but Nimitz does. So I'm sure that played a role as well.
He later advocates for conservative carrier tactics, emphasizing fleet preservation. In hindsight, how valid were Fletcher's cautionary doctrines during this 1942 uncertain carrier era? Because you want a projection by force. You don't always want to get in hot battles where your carriers are blowing up all around, right? Like, you just want to have the force available.
Right. Yeah, and I think he's walking the fine line between force preservation and also you've got to fight and defeat the enemy to win. So you need to be aggressive. And I don't know, I would hesitate to, call him overly cautious. I just think that's part of the legacy that's written into history by unfairly so by Samuel Eliot Morison and people who don't like Fletcher after the war. But where he exercised caution, I think in most instances that was probably the right call.
And I think it's just, the optics of it. Like you like to think of a Halsey or MacArthur or Patton charging into the front lines with their armies, and you don't always hear about the cautious guys who helped win the war.
Right. And, again, there's a humility. Fletcher's a very humble guy, and he's not out self-promoting either, which works against him.
Well, he retires in 1947 as a full admiral, and historians still remain divided on his reputation. He passes away in 1973. How should modern military historians assess or reassess his strategic role in the Pacific War, and what do you think his legacy is?
I think historians are already doing some very good work on that, on Fletcher, and they have done it. I mentioned John B. Lundstrom. His book Black Shoe Carrier Admiral is excellent. It's a large book, but deeply researched. He's countering the narrative from Morrison and others put out after the war. Fletcher also has a black name with the U.S. Marine Corps as the guy who abandoned Wake Island and then abandoned the Marines at Guadalcanal. And I just think both of those assessments are unfair. When you look at the situation that Fletcher was in and you assess, hey, what did he actually know at the time? Because you can do a lot. It's great to have hindsight, but when you assess command, I think you have to understand the context at the time. What did they know? What didn't they know? And what was the decision based on that, not what we know in hindsight?
Well, I think those are both false narratives. I mean, did MacArthur abandon Wainwright and his men in the Philippines? No, he was ordered to. Same thing here with Fletcher. He was ordered to go back on both of those. I just don't like the narrative surrounding that.
Same. Yeah. I think his legacy is one of, we can look favorably at his, and I certainly admire his decentralized command style. I admire his attention to logistics, and we owe Fletcher a lot of gratitude for what he and all of his commanders and his sailors and his men did in the early part of World War II to defeat the Japanese Navy and the Japanese as a whole.
Stuart, that was fantastic, my friend. Thank you for that biography on Admiral Fletcher. Again, Stuart Vanderkooi, great instructor at West Point. And we hope to have you on again soon, my friend.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity, John. I love talking about this. It's always fun. So thank you.
Well, we hope to have you back on soon, my friend.